Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the surface of your everyday consciousness, driving your desires and shaping your experiences of joy and suffering? Tonight, we embark on a contemplative exploration into the mind of Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who dared to look directly into the heart of human existence and discovered something both troubling and strangely liberating. Before we start, consider subscribing to the channel. In the quiet darkness of this moment, as the world settles into stillness around you, we invite you to drift alongside one of philosophy's most profound thinkers. Schopenhauer believed that beneath all our conscious thoughts and rational deliberations runs an ancient, blind force that he called the will. This invisible current shapes every moment of our lives, from our deepest loves to our most persistent anxieties. What makes Schopenhauer's vision so captivating is not merely its darkness, but its promise of understanding. He offered not just a diagnosis of human suffering, but glimpses of transcendence through art, compassion, and the mysterious possibility of willing nothing at all. As we journey together through his philosophical landscape, allow yourself to sink deeper into contemplation, letting these ancient insights wash over you like waves against a distant shore. Chapter 1: The Early Stirrings of Philosophical Awakening. Arthur Schopenhauer entered this world on February 22, 1788, in the merchant city of Danzig, now known as Gdansk. Born into wealth and privilege, his childhood was nonetheless marked by the kind of suffering that would later inform his deepest philosophical insights. The Schopenhauer family possessed considerable fortune through their merchant enterprises, yet young Arthur experienced profound loneliness and alienation that seemed to follow him like a shadow. When Arthur was 5 years old, his family relocated to Hamburg after Danzig fell under Prussian control. These early years of displacement and uncertainty planted seeds of what would become his acute sensitivity to the fragility of human happiness. He traveled extensively across Europe as a child, spending time in France and even attending school in England, where he developed fluency in multiple languages, but also deepened his sense of being a stranger in the world. The most formative tragedy of his youth came in 1805 when his father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, died suddenly. This devastating loss liberated Arthur from the family business, but also confronted him directly with the reality of human despair. The death of his father became a dark mirror in which the young philosopher could see reflected the fundamental suffering that he believed lay at the heart of all existence. Following his father's death, Arthur's relationship with his mother Johanna became increasingly strained. Johanna moved to Weimar and established herself as a successful novelist and salon hostess, often entertaining the great Goethe himself. Yet the distance between mother and son grew, both physical and emotional, contributing to Arthur's lifelong sense of isolation and his profound skepticism about human relationships. In these early experiences of loss, displacement, and alienation, we can already glimpse the philosophical temperament that would later produce one of the most systematic critiques of optimism in Western thought. The young man who entered the University of Göttingen in 1809 carried within him not just intellectual curiosity, but a deep personal acquaintance with suffering that would become the foundation of his mature philosophy. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Schopenhauer's World. When Schopenhauer sat down to construct his philosophical system, he began with a revolutionary insight borrowed from Immanuel Kant, but transformed into something entirely new. Kant had argued that we never experience things as they truly are, but only as they appear to us through the structures of our mind. Schopenhauer took this idea and gave it a darker, more visceral interpretation that would echo through the centuries. According to Schopenhauer, everything we ordinarily consider real, our entire experienced world of objects, people, trees, mountains, and stars, constitutes merely what he called representation. This world of representation is like an elaborate dream or illusion, structured by the mind's inherent categories of space, time, and causality. We never escape this web of mental construction to encounter reality directly. But unlike Kant, who declared the thing in itself forever unknowable, Schopenhauer believed we possessed one unique window into ultimate reality. This window was our own body, experienced not just as an object among others, but as something we inhabit from within. When you feel your heart beating, when you experience the tension of hunger or the release of satisfaction, when you feel the urge to move or act, you are experiencing what Schopenhauer called will. This will is not the rational, deliberative faculty we usually associate with decision-making. Rather, it is a blind, unconscious, insatiable striving that drives all of existence. The will is the thing in itself, the ultimate reality behind all appearances. It manifests in the force of gravity pulling objects together, in the growth of plants reaching toward light, in the complex behaviors of animals, and in the deepest human desires and aversions. What makes this vision so unsettling is Schopenhauer's recognition that the will is fundamentally without purpose or goal. It strives endlessly but toward nothing in particular. Like a wheel spinning without destination, the will generates constant motion, constant seeking, constant dissatisfaction. This aimless striving, Schopenhauer argued, is the source of all suffering in the world. The tragedy of human existence, according to this view, lies in our double nature. We are simultaneously the willing subject, driven by unconscious desires and needs, and the representing subject, capable of stepping back and observing our predicament with painful clarity. We can see our own enslavement to forces beyond our control, yet we remain largely powerless to escape them. Chapter 3: The Anatomy of Human Suffering. In Schopenhauer's philosophical vision, suffering is not an unfortunate accident or a problem to be solved through better technology or social arrangements. Instead, suffering represents the very essence of life itself. To exist is to want, and to want is to lack something, and to lack is to suffer. This creates what Schopenhauer saw as an inescapable cycle that defines the human condition. Consider the structure of desire as Schopenhauer analyzed it. When we want something, we experience the pain of absence, the tension of unfulfilled longing. This suffering drives us to pursue the object of our desire, sometimes with tremendous effort and sacrifice. But what happens when we finally obtain what we sought? For a brief moment, we may experience satisfaction, but this quickly gives way either to boredom or to new desires. Boredom, in Schopenhauer's analysis, is itself a form of suffering. It represents the will's restless demand for new objects to pursue when temporarily satisfied. The peaceful contentment we might hope to find in fulfillment proves to be merely a way station between the pain of wanting and the pain of emptiness. Thus, human life swings like a pendulum between the poles of need and tedium. Even our greatest achievements and deepest loves cannot escape this fundamental structure. The artist who completes their masterpiece soon feels the restless urge to create something new. The lover who wins their beloved discovers that possession brings its own anxieties and dissatisfactions. The successful entrepreneur finds that each victory only raises the stakes for the next challenge. Schopenhauer extended this analysis beyond individual psychology to encompass all of nature. Every living being participates in what he called the will to live, an unconscious drive towards survival and reproduction. But this creates inevitable conflict, as different manifestations of will compete for limited resources. The plant grows by extracting nutrients that might nourish other plants. The predator survives by destroying its prey. Even within a single organism, different needs and drives often conflict with one another. This led Schopenhauer to a conclusion that many found shocking. Existence itself is fundamentally a mistake, not because of any particular flaws in how the world is arranged, but because the very structure of willing existence necessarily produces more suffering than happiness. The rational response to this recognition, he argued, would be to prefer non-existence to existence. Yet Schopenhauer did not advocate suicide as the solution to this predicament. Suicide, he observed, represents not the denial of the will to live but its desperate affirmation. The suicide seeks to escape suffering, but this escape attempt itself springs from the will's own energy. Moreover, since the will is metaphysically one and eternal, individual death cannot truly resolve the problem of suffering. Chapter 4. Moments of Liberation. Despite his reputation as philosophy's great pessimist, Schopenhauer did not leave us entirely without hope. He identified two primary avenues through which human beings could temporarily escape the tyranny of willing and experience something approaching genuine peace. These moments of liberation, while temporary, offered glimpses of what existence might be like if the will could be transcended entirely. The first path of escape leads through aesthetic experience. When we become completely absorbed in contemplating a work of art or a scene of natural beauty, something remarkable happens to consciousness. The ordinary subject-object distinction begins to dissolve, and with it, our sense of personal desires and concerns. We become what Schopenhauer called pure subjects of knowing, temporarily freed from the service of individual will. In these moments of aesthetic contemplation, whether before a painting, lost in music, or absorbed in natural beauty, time seems to stop. The restless energy of wanting subsides into stillness. We no longer experience the world as a collection of objects that might satisfy or frustrate our desires, but as a pure phenomenon worthy of disinterested attention. Schopenhauer distinguished between two varieties of aesthetic experience, the beautiful and the sublime. The beautiful allows for effortless contemplation that flows naturally from our encounter with harmonious forms and pleasing proportions. The sublime, by contrast, involves initially threatening or overwhelming phenomena that we must consciously choose to contemplate rather than flee from. When we stand before a violent thunderstorm or gaze into a star-filled sky, we may first feel our individual will respond with fear or a sense of insignificance. But if we can consciously redirect our attention toward pure contemplation of these phenomena, we may experience what Schopenhauer called elevation, a mixed feeling of pain and pleasure, as we simultaneously acknowledge our physical vulnerability and celebrate our capacity to transcend it through contemplation. Music held a special place in Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory. While other arts represent the ideas that mediate between individual things and the will itself, music seemed to bypass representation entirely and speak directly to the will. In the mathematical relationships of harmony and the temporal flow of melody, Schopenhauer heard an immediate expression of willing itself, not the blind striving that causes suffering, but will be made transparent and comprehensible. The second major path of liberation leads through compassion. Ordinary human relationships are typically structured by egoism. We relate to others primarily as means to our own satisfaction or as obstacles to our desires. But sometimes we experience a mysterious shift in perspective where the boundary between self and other begins to dissolve. In genuine compassion, we feel another's suffering as directly as our own. This is not mere emotional sympathy or charitable sentiment, but a metaphysical recognition that the separation between individuals is ultimately illusory. At the deepest level, the will that drives my suffering is identical to the will that drives yours. This compassionate insight leads naturally to what Schopenhauer considered the only authentic moral behavior: actions that aim to alleviate suffering without any expectation of personal gain. When we act from genuine compassion, we temporarily transcend the egoistic perspective that normally governs human relationships and align ourselves with a deeper truth about the unity underlying apparent multiplicity. Chapter 5: The Path of Renunciation. For most people, aesthetic experience and compassionate action provide only temporary respites from the fundamental problem of existence. But Schopenhauer believed that some rare individuals might achieve a more complete liberation through what he called denial of the will. This represented the ultimate goal of his philosophy, though he acknowledged it remained mysterious and difficult to understand. Denial of the will does not mean suppressing particular desires or adopting a generally ascetic lifestyle, though it may include such practices. Rather, it involves a fundamental shift in the orientation of consciousness itself. Instead of experiencing life as a series of desires to be satisfied, The individual who has denied the will experiences a profound detachment from the entire machinery of wanting. Schopenhauer found inspiration for this possibility in the traditions of Christian mysticism, and later in his life, in Buddhist and Hindu teachings about liberation. He was particularly drawn to the Buddhist concept of nirvana, which he interpreted as the complete cessation of individual will. The Sanskrit texts he read, particularly the Upanishads in Latin translation, convinced him that the deepest insights of Eastern spirituality aligned with his own philosophical conclusions. The denial of the will typically arises, according to Schopenhauer, through one of two paths. Some individuals may achieve it through prolonged ascetic practice, the deliberate cultivation of detachment through poverty, celibacy, and contemplative discipline. Others may experience it spontaneously through intense suffering that breaks down the ordinary structures of egoistic will. What characterizes both paths is a fundamental shift in how the individual relates to their own existence. Instead of seeing life as an arena for satisfying desires, they begin to experience existence itself as something to be transcended. This does not typically lead to suicide, which Schopenhauer viewed as the ultimate expression of will rather than its denial. Instead, it produces a quiet withdrawal from the ordinary pursuits of life and a growing indifference to personal success or failure. The person who has achieved denial of the will may continue to live and even engage in ordinary activities, but their relationship to these activities has fundamentally changed. They act not from personal desire but from a kind of impersonal compassion, helping to alleviate suffering where possible, but without attachment to the results of their actions. Schopenhauer admitted that this state remained largely incomprehensible to those who had not experienced it directly. Like trying to describe color to someone born blind, the nature of will-less existence could not be adequately conveyed through concepts and arguments. It represented what he called a turning or conversion that transformed the entire orientation of consciousness. Before we continue deeper into these mysteries, take a moment to consider subscribing to this channel if you're finding value in this exploration. Your support helps us continue creating content that honors the depth and complexity of philosophical wisdom. Chapter 6: The Paradox of Willing Nothing. One of the most perplexing aspects of Schopenhauer's philosophy concerns the mechanism by which the will might deny itself. If we are fundamentally willing beings, driven by unconscious forces beyond our rational control, how can we achieve the very detachment that his philosophy recommends? This paradox troubled many of Schopenhauer's critics and continues to challenge contemporary interpreters. The problem can be stated simply. It seems that we must stop willing, desire to end desire, strive to cease striving. But if the denial of will requires an act of will, then we appear caught in a logical contradiction. Moreover, if we succeed in completely eliminating willingness, what remains of consciousness or existence itself? Schopenhauer was aware of this difficulty and offered several responses, though none entirely resolved the paradox. First, He suggested that the will contains within itself different levels or types of will. The ordinary will that drives our everyday desires and actions represents only the most superficial layer of will. At a deeper level, he argued, there exists what might be called a will to will-lessness, a fundamental drive toward transcendence that can potentially overcome the more obvious forms of willing. This deeper will manifests most clearly in aesthetic experience and compassionate action, where we temporarily transcend egoistic concerns. In these moments, we experience a different kind of will, one that aims not at personal satisfaction, but at pure contemplation or selfless service. Schopenhauer suggested that this alternative form of will might gradually strengthen until it could completely overcome the ordinary will to live. Second, he emphasized that the transition to will-lessness typically occurs not through deliberate effort, but through a kind of spontaneous conversion or turning. Like the moment when we suddenly understand a difficult mathematical proof or recognize a familiar face in a crowd, the denial of will often happens suddenly and without obvious causal preparation. This spontaneous quality helps explain why ascetic practices, while potentially helpful, cannot guarantee liberation. The monk who deliberately cultivates detachment through fasting and meditation may or may not achieve genuine will-lessness. Conversely, someone who has never heard of philosophical or spiritual teachings might spontaneously experience the turning that leads to liberation. Schopenhauer also drew on his understanding of Eastern spirituality to suggest that the denial of will does not result in complete annihilation, but rather in a state of being that transcends the ordinary categories of existence and non-existence. Like the Buddhist concept of nirvana, will-lessness represents not a simple negation, but a positive state that cannot be adequately described in conventional terms. The individual who has achieved this state continues to exist in some sense, but their existence no longer involves the restless striving that characterizes ordinary consciousness. They may continue to perform actions and engage with the world, but these actions arise not from personal desire, but from a kind of spontaneous compassion that flows naturally from their recognition of the illusory nature of individual separation. Chapter 7. The Influence of Eastern Wisdom. Schopenhauer's encounter with Indian philosophy profoundly shaped his mature philosophical system, though his understanding of these traditions was filtered through limited and often unreliable translations available in early 19th century Europe. His primary source was a Latin translation of Persian versions of Sanskrit Upanishads, a text he discovered in 1814 that he would later call the consolation of my life and my death. This text, known as the Upanishad, had been translated into Persian by the Mughal Prince Dara Shikoh in the 17th century, then rendered into Latin by the French Orientalist Anquetil Duperron. The multiple layers of translation and interpretation meant that Schopenhauer was receiving Indian philosophical concepts that had already been significantly modified by Islamic and European influences. Nevertheless, Schopenhauer found in these texts what he believed to be confirmation of his own philosophical insights. The concept of Maya, or illusion, seemed to correspond to his notion of the world as representation. The idea of Brahman as ultimate reality resonated with his understanding of will as the thing in itself. The emphasis on suffering as fundamental to existence aligned with his pessimistic analysis of the human condition. When Schopenhauer later encountered more accurate information about Buddhism, he became even more convinced that Eastern spirituality had anticipated his philosophical conclusions. The Buddha's first noble truth, that existence is characterized by dukkha or suffering, seemed to confirm Schopenhauer's own analysis. The Buddhist goal of liberation from samsara, the cycle of birth and death, paralleled his concept of denying the will to live. However, Schopenhauer's interpretation of Eastern philosophy was selective and often projected his own concerns onto very different conceptual frameworks. The Vedantic teaching that ultimate reality is Sat Chitananda, existence consciousness bliss, sits uncomfortably with Schopenhauer's characterization of the will as blind and purposeless. Buddhist teachings about compassion and skillful action do not necessarily support his extreme pessimism about worldly existence. Moreover, Schopenhauer tended to emphasize the world-denying aspects of Eastern spirituality, while downplaying elements that affirm the potential for wisdom and happiness within ordinary existence. His reading was influenced by European Romantic assumptions about the mystical East that often distorted the actual content of Asian philosophical traditions. Despite these limitations, Schopenhauer's engagement with Eastern thought represented a significant expansion of European philosophical horizons. He was among the first Western philosophers to take Asian intellectual traditions seriously as sources of philosophical insight, rather than merely exotic curiosities. His synthesis of German idealism with Indian concepts of Maya and liberation opened new possibilities for cross-cultural philosophical dialogue. The influence flowed both ways. Schopenhauer's interpretation of Eastern wisdom significantly shaped how later European and American thinkers understood Buddhism and Vedanta. His emphasis on pessimism and world denial became associated with these traditions in the Western imagination, even when such characterizations oversimplified or misrepresented the actual teachings. Chapter 8: Art as Temporary Salvation. Music, painting, sculpture, and poetry occupied a central place in Schopenhauer's philosophy, not as mere entertainment or cultural ornament, but as potential vehicles for the most profound form of human knowledge. Through aesthetic experience, he argued, we could temporarily transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness and glimpse something approaching ultimate truth. The key to understanding Schopenhauer's aesthetics lies in his theory of ideas, borrowed and modified from Plato. These ideas represent intermediate stages between the unified will and the multiplicity of individual things we encounter in ordinary experience. When we contemplate a work of art or natural beauty with complete absorption, We temporarily transcend awareness of particular objects and their relationships to our personal desires, instead apprehending the eternal ideas that these objects imperfectly express. Consider what happens when you become completely lost in a piece of music. The ordinary stream of thoughts, worries, and plans that usually occupies consciousness fades into the background. You are no longer thinking about your personal situation or calculating how the music might serve your interests. Instead, you become pure receptive, allowing the mathematical relationships of harmony and the temporal flow of melody to carry you beyond the boundaries of individual selfhood. This aesthetic absorption temporarily liberates us from what Schopenhauer called the wheel of Ixion, the endless cycle of desire, temporary satisfaction, and renewed desire that normally characterizes human existence. In the timeless moment of aesthetic contemplation, we experience what he described as will-less consciousness. We continue to exist and to be aware, but our awareness is no longer organized around personal needs and projects. Different art forms achieve this liberation through different means. Architecture works with the most basic forces of gravity, support, and resistance, allowing us to contemplate the fundamental ideas that govern physical existence. Sculpture and painting represent living forms and human expressions, enabling us to apprehend the ideas that manifest in organic life and consciousness. Poetry uses language to evoke ideas that transcend the particular circumstances it describes. But music holds a unique position in Schopenhauer's hierarchy of arts. While other art forms represent ideas that mediate between will and individual phenomena, music seemed to bypass this mediation entirely. In the mathematical relationships of harmony and the temporal unfolding of melody, Schopenhauer heard a direct expression of the will itself, not will as blind striving, but will be made transparent and comprehensible. This is why music can move us so profoundly even when we cannot explain its meaning in conceptual terms. The rising and falling of melodic lines, the tension and resolution of harmonic progressions, the interplay of rhythm and silence, all these mirror the deeper patterns of willing itself. Through music, we experience it not as the enemy of peace, but as a cosmic principle worthy of aesthetic contemplation. The genius of the artist lies precisely in their capacity to perceive ideas directly and to create works that can evoke similar perception in others. The great artist is someone who can temporarily escape the prison of personal will and perceive the eternal patterns that underlie appearances. Their works serve as vehicles through which others might achieve similar moments of liberation. Yet Schopenhauer also emphasized the temporary nature of aesthetic salvation. No matter how profound our absorption in art or natural beauty, we eventually return to ordinary consciousness with its familiar patterns of desire and frustration. Aesthetic experience provides respite from suffering rather than permanent cure. For that, something more radical is required. Chapter 9. The Compassionate Recognition. Compassion represents more than moral sentiment or charitable feeling in Schopenhauer's philosophy. It constitutes a form of metaphysical insight that temporarily dissolves the illusion of individual separation. When we experience genuine compassion, we directly recognize that the suffering we witness in another is fundamentally identical to our own suffering. This recognition occurs not through rational argument but through immediate experience. In the moment of compassionate response, the ordinary boundaries between self and others become permeable. We feel the other's pain not as something external that we observe and pity, but as our own pain experienced in another location. This is possible, Schopenhauer argued, because at the deepest metaphysical level, there is only one will manifesting in all individual beings. The ethical implications of this insight extend far beyond conventional morality. Most ethical systems, Schopenhauer observed, are ultimately based on egoism. They encourage moral behavior by appealing to self-interest, whether in the form of social approval, divine reward, or rational consistency. But genuine compassion requires no external motivation, because it springs from the direct recognition that helping another is literally helping oneself. This compassionate recognition manifests most clearly in moments of crisis, when we respond to others' suffering without calculation or hesitation. The person who rushes to help someone in danger, the parent who sacrifices for their child, the stranger who offers comfort to someone in grief. In these moments, ordinary egoistic consciousness gives way to something deeper and more fundamental. Schopenhauer distinguished compassion from mere sympathy or emotional contagion. Sympathy involves feeling upset because another person is upset, but this reaction may still be organized around personal concerns. We suffer because their suffering disturbs our peace of mind. Genuine compassion involves recognizing the other's suffering as our own suffering appearing in a different form. This recognition naturally leads to what Schopenhauer considered the only authentic moral virtues: justice and loving kindness. Justice involves recognizing that others have the same fundamental right to avoid suffering that we claim for ourselves. Loving kindness goes further, actively seeking to promote others' well-being from the recognition that their well-being is identical to our own. The political and social implications of Schopenhauer's ethics remain complex and sometimes troubling. On one hand, his emphasis on compassion as the basis of morality provides a foundation for universal concern that transcends conventional boundaries of nation, race, and class. If all suffering is fundamentally one suffering, then all beings deserve equal moral consideration. On the other hand, Schopenhauer's pessimism about the possibility of significantly reducing suffering through social reform led him to be skeptical of political activism and revolutionary change. He tended to see such efforts as expressions of the very willing that causes suffering in the first place. This created a tension in his philosophy between compassionate concern for suffering and quietistic acceptance of existing conditions. Modern interpreters have struggled with this aspect of Schopenhauer's legacy. Some argue that genuine compassion must lead to active engagement with systems that cause unnecessary suffering. Others maintain that Schopenhauer's emphasis on inner transformation provides a necessary complement to external social action. If you're finding these ideas thought-provoking, I encourage you to share your reflections in the comments below. What aspects of Schopenhauer's understanding of compassion resonate with your own experience of human connection? Chapter 10. The Influence on Modern Thought. Schopenhauer's philosophy profoundly shaped the intellectual landscape of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, influencing thinkers who both embraced and rejected his conclusions. His emphasis on unconscious drives, his analysis of suffering, and his aesthetic theory provided conceptual foundations for developments in psychology, philosophy, and the arts that continue to influence contemporary thought. Friedrich Nietzsche represents perhaps the most complex case of Schopenhauerian influence. As a young man, Nietzsche encountered Schopenhauer's works and found in them a philosophical vision that seemed to address his deepest concerns about meaning and value in a post-religious age. Schopenhauer's willingness to confront the darker aspects of existence without retreating into comforting illusions inspired Nietzsche's own philosophical development. Yet Nietzsche ultimately rejected what he saw as Schopenhauer's life-denying conclusions. Where Schopenhauer counseled resignation and withdrawal from willing, Nietzsche advocated an enthusiastic affirmation of existence that would embrace even its most painful aspects. The will that Schopenhauer sought to deny became, in Nietzsche's hands, the will to power that should be celebrated and cultivated. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory shows clear traces of Schopenhauerian influence, particularly in its emphasis on unconscious drives and the role of repression in mental life. Freud's concept of the libido as a blind, insatiable force driving human behavior echoes Schopenhauer's characterization of will. The psychoanalytic understanding of symptoms as expressions of repressed desires parallels Schopenhauer's analysis of how the will manifests in consciousness. Freud's later concept of the death drive showed even more direct Schopenhauerian influence. The idea that human beings harbor a fundamental tendency toward dissolution and return to an inorganic state closely resembles Schopenhauer's analysis of the will's ultimate goal as its own negation. However, Freud's therapeutic optimism differed markedly from Schopenhauer's philosophical pessimism. The existentialist movement of the 20th century engaged with Schopenhauerian themes while rejecting his metaphysical conclusions. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus shared Schopenhauer's recognition that human existence lacks inherent meaning or purpose. However, where Schopenhauer saw this as grounds for world denial, the existentialists advocated creating meaning through authentic choice and action. Schopenhauer's influence on literature and the arts proved equally significant. Writers like Thomas Hardy, Marcel Proust, and Thomas Mann incorporated Schopenhauerian themes into their explorations of human nature and social life. The symbolist movement in poetry drew inspiration from his aesthetic theory, particularly his understanding of art as providing access to eternal ideas beyond ordinary experience. Richard Wagner's operas represent perhaps the most ambitious attempt to create art according to Schopenhauer's aesthetic principles. Wagner saw in Schopenhauer's philosophy of music a theoretical foundation for his own concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or a total work of art. The Ring Cycle and Parsifal explicitly dramatize Schopenhauerian themes of desire, suffering, and redemption. Contemporary philosophers continue to engage with Schopenhauerian ideas, particularly in areas like philosophy of mind, ethics, and environmental philosophy. His early recognition of the continuity between human and animal consciousness has found new relevance in light of recent research in cognitive science and neurobiology. His emphasis on compassion as the foundation of ethics resonates with Buddhist-influenced approaches to moral philosophy. Environmental philosophers have found in Schopenhauer's critique of anthropocentrism and his recognition of unity underlying apparent diversity conceptual resources for developing more ecologically sensitive worldviews. His understanding of aesthetic experience as involving temporary transcendence of egoistic perspective has influenced contemporary discussions of environmental ethics and the intrinsic value of nature. Chapter 11. The Mystery of Genius. In Schopenhauer's philosophical system, genius represents a fascinating anomaly individual who seem capable of temporarily transcending the ordinary limitations of human consciousness and accessing forms of knowledge unavailable to others. The genius possesses an unusual capacity for aesthetic contemplation, able to perceive the eternal ideas that ordinary consciousness cannot directly apprehend. What distinguishes genius from ordinary intelligence is not greater reasoning ability or factual knowledge, but rather an enhanced capacity for what Schopenhauer called objective perception. While most people perceive the world primarily in relation to their personal needs and desires, the genius can temporarily transcend this subjective perspective and see things as they are in themselves. This capacity manifests most clearly in artistic creation. The great artist perceives ideas, eternal patterns that individual things imperfectly express, and creates works that can evoke similar perceptions in others. The landscape painter does not merely copy particular trees and mountains, but captures the idea of nature itself that these individual phenomena express. The portrait artist reveals not just a person's physical appearance, but the idea of humanity that shines through their particular features. Schopenhauer's theory of genius helps explain why great art seems to speak to universal human experiences, despite emerging from particular historical and cultural contexts. The ideas that genius perceives are not bound by time and place. They represent eternal patterns that underlie the apparent diversity of human experience. This is why we can be moved by art from distant cultures and historical periods. It speaks to something in us that transcends our individual circumstances. However, genius comes at a significant cost. The same sensitivity that enables aesthetic insight also makes genius more vulnerable to suffering. The person who can perceive ideas directly is also more acutely aware of the gap between ideal and reality, between the perfect forms glimpsed in aesthetic contemplation and the imperfect world of ordinary experience. Moreover, the genius's capacity for objective perception often creates difficulties in practical life. Someone who habitually sees beyond immediate circumstances to eternal patterns may struggle with the mundane requirements of social existence. They may appear impractical, absent-minded, or even eccentric to others who are more successfully adapted to conventional expectations. Schopenhauer distinguished between genius proper, which manifests primarily in artistic creation, and related phenomena like talent, cleverness, and learning. Talent represents a high degree of ordinary intelligence applied to particular domains, while genius involves a qualitatively different form of consciousness. A talented musician might achieve technical mastery and even compose pleasing works, but genius would perceive and express something in music that transcends technique and cultural convention. The relationship between genius and madness interested Schopenhauer considerably. He observed that both conditions involve departure from ordinary consciousness, but in opposite directions. The genius transcends normal awareness by perceiving eternal ideas, while madness represents a breakdown in the ordinary structures that organize experience. However, the intensity required for genius-level perception might sometimes destabilize these ordinary structures, leading to the correlation between artistic creativity and mental instability that many have observed. Schopenhauer's theory of genius has influenced subsequent discussions of creativity, artistic inspiration, and the nature of aesthetic experience. His emphasis on the genius's capacity to transcend personal perspective and perceive universal patterns resonates with romantic and post-romantic theories of artistic creation. However, his individualistic focus has been challenged by those who emphasize the social and cultural dimensions of artistic production. Chapter 12: Time, Memory, and the Illusion of Progress. One of Schopenhauer's most unsettling insights concerned the nature of temporal existence and humanity's persistent belief in progress. While most people experience life as a meaningful narrative moving toward goals and achievements, Schopenhauer saw time as an illusion that masks the fundamentally repetitive nature of existence. From the perspective of the will, there is no real development or advancement, only the endless repetition of the same basic patterns. Each generation faces the same fundamental challenges: birth, growth, desire, frustration, aging, and death. What we call progress represents merely superficial changes in the external conditions under which these eternal patterns unfold. Consider how memory functions in human experience. We tend to remember pleasures as more intense and lasting than they actually were, while painful experiences fade more quickly from conscious recollection. This creates the illusion that the past was generally happier than the present, and encourages us to believe that future achievements might bring lasting satisfaction. But Schopenhauer argued that this memorial distortion prevents us from learning the fundamental lesson that experience teaches. No achievement, no matter how long desired or how completely attained, provides more than temporary satisfaction before giving way to new desires or boredom. Each generation must rediscover this truth for itself, because the illusions of memory and hope prevent the accumulation of genuine wisdom about the nature of existence. The belief in progress, whether individual or collective, serves the will's purposes by keeping us engaged in the endless cycle of striving. If we truly believed that no fundamental improvement in the human condition was possible, we might lose motivation for the activities that perpetuate the species. The illusion of progress thus functions as what we might now call an evolutionary adaptation that ensures continued reproduction and cultural development. Schopenhauer extended this analysis to human history and social development. While external conditions might change, technology develops, political systems evolve, cultural forms shift, the underlying patterns of human desire, conflict, and suffering remain constant. What we call civilization represents increasingly sophisticated ways of organizing and expressing the same basic drives that have always characterized human existence. This perspective creates a profound challenge to conventional notions of meaning and purpose. If individual lives and human history alike consist of variations on eternal themes, rather than genuine development toward goals, what significance can our efforts and achievements possess? Schopenhauer's answer was that significance must be found not in temporal progress, but in moments of transcendence that lift us out of time altogether. Aesthetic experience and compassionate recognition both involve temporary escape from temporal consciousness. In these moments, we touch something eternal that exists beyond the realm of change and development. Similarly, the ultimate goal of denying the will involves transcending temporal existence entirely rather than achieving some goal within time. This understanding of time and progress has influenced subsequent philosophical and literary treatments of these themes. The existentialist emphasis on authentic existence in the face of historical meaninglessness shows clear Schopenhauerian influence. Postmodern skepticism about grand narratives of progress also echoes Schopenhauer's critique of temporal illusions. Chapter 13: The Social Dimension of Suffering. While Schopenhauer is often characterized as a philosopher of individual psychology, his analysis of suffering extended to social and political phenomena in ways that remain relevant to contemporary discussions. He saw human societies not as solutions to the problems of individual existence, but as complex systems that often magnify and systematize the suffering that springs from individual will. The fundamental challenge of social existence, according to Schopenhauer, lies in the conflict between individual egoism and the requirements of collective life. Each person naturally seeks to satisfy their own desires, but this inevitably brings them into conflict with others who are pursuing their own satisfactions. The result is what he called the hedgehog dilemma. Individuals need social contact for warmth and security, but close proximity inevitably leads to mutual harm. Political institutions and legal systems represent attempts to manage this fundamental tension, but they cannot eliminate it. Laws and social conventions can regulate the external expression of egoistic drives, but they cannot change the underlying nature that produces these drives. At best, political arrangements can create frameworks within which individual suffering is minimized and social cooperation becomes possible. Schopenhauer was particularly skeptical of revolutionary movements and utopian schemes that promise to eliminate suffering through social reorganization. Such efforts, he argued, typically spring from the very willing that causes suffering in the first place. The revolutionaries' desire to create a perfect society represents another form of the insatiable striving that characterizes all willing existence. Moreover, Schopenhauer observed that social reforms often simply shift the locus of suffering rather than eliminating it. The abolition of one form of inequality or injustice may create conditions for new forms to emerge. This does not mean that specific reforms are worthless, but it suggests that they cannot address the fundamental source of human misery. The only authentic basis for social ethics, according to Schopenhauer, is compassion, the recognition that others' suffering is fundamentally identical to one's own. This recognition naturally leads to justice, treating others with the same consideration we demand for ourselves, and loving kindness, actively promoting others' welfare. However, genuine compassion cannot be created through political institutions or moral education. It must arise spontaneously from insight into the metaphysical unity underlying apparent individual separation. This creates a tension in Schopenhauer's social philosophy between ethical idealism and political pessimism. On one hand, his ethics provides a foundation for universal moral concern that transcends conventional boundaries. On the other hand, his analysis suggests that most people are incapable of the insight necessary for genuine compassion, making large-scale social transformation unlikely. Contemporary interpreters have struggled with this aspect of Schopenhauer's legacy. Some argue that his emphasis on individual transformation provides necessary grounding for social change by addressing the root causes of conflict and injustice. Others contend that his political pessimism undermines the possibility of effective response to systematic forms of oppression and exploitation. The relevance of Schopenhauer's social analysis to contemporary issues remains debated. His recognition that individual psychology and social structures are intimately connected anticipates modern insights in social psychology and political theory. However, his skepticism about the possibility of fundamental social progress conflicts with movements for social justice that assume human arrangements can be significantly improved. As we near the end of our exploration, take a moment to reflect on how these ideas might apply to your own experience of social relationships and community life. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section. What aspects of Schopenhauer's social philosophy do you find most compelling or troubling? Chapter 14. The Aesthetic of Existence. As we draw toward the close of our contemplative journey through Schopenhauer's philosophical landscape, we encounter perhaps his most paradoxical insight. Despite his reputation as philosophy's great pessimist, Schopenhauer discovered in existence itself an aesthetic dimension that could justify our continued presence in this difficult world. The capacity for aesthetic experience represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. In those moments when we become completely absorbed in natural beauty or artistic creation, we temporarily transcend the ordinary boundaries of selfhood and touch something eternal. These experiences cannot eliminate suffering, but they reveal that consciousness possesses resources that extend far beyond the satisfaction of personal desires. What makes aesthetic experience so significant is not its duration. These moments are typically brief, but its quality. In aesthetic contemplation, we experience what existence might be like if we were not constantly driven by the machinery of wanting. We discover that consciousness itself, freed from the service of individual will, possesses an intrinsic value that does not depend on external circumstances. This aesthetic dimension of existence helps explain why Schopenhauer, despite his philosophical pessimism, never advocated wholesale rejection of life. The same consciousness that experiences suffering also possesses the capacity for forms of knowledge and appreciation that transcend suffering. The philosopher who recognizes life's fundamental negativity may also be the person most capable of appreciating the rare moments when that negativity is temporarily suspended. Art serves not as escape from reality, but as revelation of reality's deepest possibilities. The great artist shows us what we might see if we could look beyond our personal preoccupations to perceive the eternal patterns that underlie temporal appearances. In this sense, aesthetic experience provides a foretaste of the complete liberation that Schopenhauer associated with the denial of will. The relationship between aesthetic experience and philosophical insight proved central to Schopenhauer's understanding of his own intellectual development. He saw philosophy not as abstract theorizing, but as a form of conceptual art that could evoke in readers something approaching the direct perceptions that inspired the original philosophical insights. His own prose style, with its careful attention to rhythm and metaphor, reflects this aesthetic understanding of philosophical expression. This aesthetic dimension also helps explain Schopenhauer's profound influence on artists and writers who found in his philosophy not a counsel of despair, but a validation of art's deepest purposes. If existence is fundamentally tragic, then artistic creation becomes one of the few activities that can justify human presence in the world. The artist who creates beauty from suffering performs a kind of alchemy that transforms meaningless pain into meaningful expression. The aesthetic of existence extends beyond formal art to encompass what we might call the art of living itself. The person who learns to perceive beauty in ordinary phenomena, the play of light on water, the flight of birds, the expressions of human faces, discovers resources for enduring existence that do not depend on the satisfaction of personal ambitions. In this perspective, Schopenhauer's philosophy emerges not as a rejection of life, but as an attempt to live more consciously and appreciatively within the constraints that existence imposes. The recognition that suffering is inevitable becomes the starting point for discovering what remains possible when we no longer demand that existence conform to our desires. As we reach the conclusion of our nocturnal journey through Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophical universe, we find ourselves in a place that is both darker and more luminous than we might have expected. The philosopher who earned his reputation as the great pessimist of Western thought also revealed profound sources of meaning and beauty that remain available even within the constraints of a fundamentally tragic existence. Schopenhauer's central insight, that beneath all our conscious deliberations and rational plans runs a blind, insatiable force he called the will, continues to resonate in an age when psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral economics have confirmed many aspects of his analysis of human irrationality. We are indeed driven by forces largely beyond our conscious control, and our attempts to find lasting satisfaction through the fulfillment of desires do seem to lead to the endless cycle of temporary satisfaction and renewed wanting that he described. Yet Schopenhauer also identified genuine possibilities for transcendence that remain as relevant today as they were 2 centuries ago. The capacity for aesthetic experience, those moments when we become completely absorbed in beauty and temporarily forget our personal concerns, continues to provide respite from the pressures of willing existence. The recognition of deep compassion that dissolves the boundaries between self and other still offers foundation for authentic ethical life. Perhaps most importantly, Schopenhauer's analysis of the denial of will points toward possibilities for inner transformation that neither require nor guarantee external changes in life circumstances. The peace he associated with the complete transcendence of willing represents an ideal that can orient our efforts toward wisdom, even if it remains practically unattainable. The influence of Schopenhauer's ideas on subsequent philosophy, psychology, literature, and art testifies to their enduring relevance. From Nietzsche's wrestling with pessimism to Freud's exploration of unconscious drives, from the existentialist's confrontation with meaninglessness to contemporary discussions of mindfulness and compassion, Schopenhauer's insights continue to shape how we understand human nature and possibility. His engagement with Eastern philosophical traditions, however limited and filtered through the translations available to him, opened pathways for cross-cultural dialogue about suffering, liberation, and the nature of consciousness that remain vital today. His recognition that wisdom traditions across cultures have identified similar insights about the human condition suggests that his philosophical conclusions touch on something universal in human experience. As you drift toward sleep, carrying these philosophical reflections with you, consider what Schopenhauer might offer to our contemporary moment. In an age of constant stimulation and endless opportunities for desire satisfaction. His analysis of the futility of seeking happiness through achievement and acquisition speaks with particular urgency. In a time of increasing social fragmentation and conflict, his understanding of compassion as recognition of fundamental unity offers resources for healing. The questions that drove Schopenhauer's philosophical inquiry remain as pressing now as they were in his time. What does it mean to live consciously in a world that seems fundamentally indifferent to human aspirations? How can we find sources of meaning and value that do not depend on the satisfaction of personal desires? What possibilities exist for transcending the ego-centered perspective that generates so much suffering? Schopenhauer's answers to these questions may not satisfy everyone, but his willingness to confront them directly and systematically continues to inspire those who seek wisdom over mere cleverness, depth over superficiality, and truth over comforting illusions. His philosophy offers not easy solutions, but rather the kind of understanding that can transform how we relate to the fundamental conditions of existence. In the stillness of this moment, as consciousness begins to merge with sleep, perhaps we can glimpse something of what Schopenhauer called will-lessness, a state of being that neither grasps nor rejects, but simply rests in awareness itself. Whether this represents genuine philosophical insight or merely the natural rhythm of tired minds approaching rest, it offers a fitting close to our exploration of one of philosophy's most profound and challenging thinkers. If this exploration has sparked your curiosity about Schopenhauer's ideas or philosophy more generally, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content that honors the depth and complexity of human wisdom. Share in the comments below what aspect of Schopenhauer's philosophy most resonated with your own experience, or what questions it raised for you. Your engagement helps us continue creating content that takes seriously both the beauty and difficulty of conscious existence. The conversation between philosophy and lived experience continues in each moment of reflection, in each act of compassion, and in each instance when we choose understanding over mere reaction. In this sense, Schopenhauer's philosophy lives not in his texts alone, but in the ongoing human effort to live more wakefully within the mystery of existence itself. Sleep well, knowing that consciousness itself, this very capacity for awareness that allows you to contemplate these profound questions, represents one of the universe's most extraordinary achievements, deserving of both wonder and gratitude, regardless of what tomorrow may bring.